Well, guys, I'll give the disclaimer after we run the numbers and do stuffs, but I'm going to start with 12 Play by R. Kelly. In the opener, you heard the big single off this one, Bump and Grind, and now you're going to hear
Part
It's
two, John.
sexy.
Sex
Not
Me
just
Part 2. Yeah.
yeah, the numbers here. So 12 Play by R. Kelly comes in at number 5,525 in the 1990s on Best Ever Albums. Number 538 in 1993. Number 34,572 of all time. It is R. Kelly's highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. And R. Kelly is ranked number 7,789 of overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums.
All right, so R. Kelly, it's Robert Sylvester Kelly, January 8th, 1967. He has sold over 75 million albums worldwide.
Well, he needed that
is
money.
the most successful commercial R&B male artist of the 1990s and one of the biggest selling music artists of all time. Let's just go ahead and do the disclaimer for those listening. I know there will be people listening that will not be comfortable that we're covering this album. I can speak for Josh and Matt that I think we all are in the lane of we are pretty good at separating the art from the artist. So we are going to take the lane of talking about this from the standpoint of the art, right? And detaching the artist from it. Now, it is impossible to not factor in some of the parts of the artist, and we will talk about that within it. But in terms of any praise or criticism on here, if you are the type of person that cannot do that, I totally understand, but this will probably not be the segment for you. Also, in all
We don't
honesty, while
condone anything R. Kelly has done or did.
no, and if we're being very honest too, we put that caveat in here, and there were some pretty, and this is the understatement of the year, but egregious things in his history. But
Yeah.
let's be honest, we've covered some folks already that have done some pretty egregious things too, and didn't do that. So, I'll put that caveat on. And before we go, anything you guys want to add to that, or does that pretty much cover it?
No, I mean, you can read all about R. Kelly's history, and he became, he went through this like period of being a joke and like being a parody of himself to like actually having issues and being a criminal and committing, really bad things.
Well,
so
and we'll talk a little bit about it because it is a part of the narrative here. He does have 18 studio albums. He has a bunch of
18?
18
Jeez.
studio albums. Yep, he has a bunch of Grammys. He also, this is one I think, guys, because I think there was a period of time, and I'm gonna go ahead and call out our tribe, guys. I think there are a lot of white people who had no idea how big an artist R. Kelly was, like in the culture, but especially in black culture. You know what I mean? Because I definitely knew people when the controversy was coming that were kind of like, who is this guy and stuff. And when you look at his record sales, they're huge, like huge. I'm talking like biggest, R&B urban act of the 90s, huge. And to give you an idea of how huge he was, he wrote the song You Are Not Alone by Michael Jackson. And that was the first song in history to debut at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 of all time. And he actually almost under a year later, almost did it again with I Believe I Can Fly, which was the the Space Jam soundtrack. And those were in the same year. So those were 2 songs that he wrote. He, of course, had other pretty huge hits, some on this album. Most notably Bump and Grind and Your Body's Callin'. And then later he'd have songs like Fiesta Remix, Ignition Remix, The World's Greatest, and many, many others that were top 10 hits as well. So we talked about the hits. We talked about the Grammys. He has one of those epic childhoods. He was born in south side of Chicago, Illinois, in the city's Hyde Park neighborhood. He has 5 siblings. His mom was deeply religious, and he did not know his biological father. He did have a stepfather from the age of 5 on. And so R. Kelly has one of these epic childhoods. He had a young friend he identified as a girlfriend who died at the age of 8 in a drowning accident that he said she was sort of like his first inspiration, but she unfortunately was pushed into a body of water and drowned, and he was aware of that. It deeply affected him. he said it was their last play date, and he witnessed this. There are many instances of interesting psychosexual behavior. His younger brother, Carrie, said that Carrie, suffered from years of sexual abuse at the hands of an older sister who was entrusted with babysitting the siblings. He said that while their older brother, Bruce, was allowed to play outside, both he and Robert were punished at separate times indoors by Teresa with sexual abuse. Now, she has denied this, so it's important to state that, but that was there. He also mentioned that he was sexually abused by an older male who was a friend of the family. In his autobiography Soulcaster, and he also says at different times that he was forced to film an adult woman in the household having intercourse with an adult male partner at the age of 8. He also at one point was shot in the shoulder at age 13 by boys who were attempting to steal his bike. So this is not to absolve him of his future behavior, but there's an interesting alchemy of stuff floating around. He also was diagnosed with dyslexia as a kid, and reading and writing was very difficult for him. But as I said before, he was sort of a busker in high school. He would go to like the Chicago L tracks and perform. He was in performing arts programs where he was really encouraged by teachers there to sort of pursue a career in music. And he also was a pretty good basketball player. There is a famous basketball player, tragic figure, Benji Wilson, who they actually made a 30 for 30 about him, I believe. And he did play basketball with him, and he was sort of an all-state player who died young, sort of lost to the streets, I guess is the best way to put that. So fast forward ahead, R. Kelly in 1989 begins his career. He is in the interestingly named MGM, alternatingly musically gifted men or mentally gifted men, depending on how you look at it. He was in there with 3 other folks, and they were offered a contract with an independent label in 1990. They released a single, and they got on the show Big Break, which was hosted by Natalie Cole. And then that song would sort of get R. Kelly attention, and he ends up in a group called Public Announcement. And Public Announcement is basically R. Kelly's backing band, is probably the best way to put it. So he got a contract with Jive Records in 1991 and released a debut album, Born into the 1990s. It's credited as R. Kelly and Public Announcement, but sometimes you'll just see it as Public Announcement. It did pretty well. It's heavily New Jack Swing, and it's got a couple relatively big hits on the R&B charts, like She's Got That Vibe, Honey Love, Dedicated, and a song called Slow Dance. All of them with Robert Kelly on the vocals, and they embarked on a tour. And then R. Kelly decides to separate from the group, and that leads to 12 Play, this album, which was released on November 9th, 1993. It topped the R&B album charts for 9 consecutive weeks and reached number 2 on the overall U.S. Billboard 200 chart. He ended up having a number 1 single with Bump and Grind, which stood out because there weren't a lot of pure R&B songs that hit the number 1 charts ever, but that one did. Your Body's Callin' hit number 13 on the U.S. charts. These songs were all number 1s on the R&B charts, I should say. And then Sex Me Parts 1 and 2 hit number 20 on the U.S. charts. And these albums, technically, this one is considered the first of a trilogy of albums. TP2.com in 2000 and TP3 Reloaded in 2005 are considered to be number 2 and number 3 in that trilogy. It received a mixed response from critics when it came out, but later gained in esteem, I would say, as time went on. Just to kind of put a postscript, because this is the only time we're going to be covering him in the long form, R. Kelly went on, as I said before, to be the number 1 selling R&B artist of the 90s. It continues into the 2000s. Josh sort of mentioned that he alternated between periods of being in the public spotlight, mixed with sort of like eccentric behavior. Some of the eccentric behavior was more of the comical version, like the trapped in the closet stuff. But beginning
Yeah.
in the beginning in the 90s, there was always some stuff around R. Kelly that was there. I think he secretly married Aaliyah, who he produced her first album. She was 15. They sort of misrepresented her as 18 on the marriage certificate. I believe he was 27 at the time. So that marriage obviously was not so legal. And Aaliyah's parents had it annulled 3 years later. It was sort of like a well-known secret in the music industry. Then later, there was a tape of Robert Kelly having sex with an underage woman sent to the Chicago Sun-Times. And they sort of reported on it. But, you know, when that went to trial, that and a couple other cases also related to him being involved in sexual relationships with underage women were sort of cleared due to lack of evidence or people not testifying. And sort of this just kept becoming a theme over time. And the Chicago Sun-Times sort of stayed on the case. And later, some families of some young women contacted Chicago Sun-Times and said that their daughters were being sort of held in a cult-like environment. And there was a Surviving R. Kelly was actually made by the Lifetime Network to sort of bring attention to it. And really, that was when things went from being sort of hidden in public to turning quickly into people saying, well, like, how did this go on for so long? And the decline was quick because some cases were brought and he was found guilty and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. So he will be in his mid 80s. Excuse me, he will be 78. I apologize, when he is scheduled for release. So that is where he's there. So we probably have to do that. Probably one of the more like interesting is one of those loaded words, because there's interesting bad, interesting good, interesting typical, interesting atypical. Now that we've got that out of the way, I think we're going to go over and talk about the album itself and the music, because it was a highly influential album. Boy, Matt, you want to start with this one?
Sure, I'll start with this album. All right, so I
we
don't
got
know.
through Michael Jackson, so
Yeah.
Yes,
we can do
yeah,
this.
and I'm gonna touch upon that as well. So I didn't know any of these songs. I didn't know Bump and Grind. I told Sherry we're covering this. She's like,
Really?
She started singing Bump and Grind, and when I heard it, I was like, I don't really remember this. Like, I certainly remember
Wow.
I Believe I Can Fly. And I'm sure there's probably other R. Kelly that I know, but
To
yeah,
say that
man,
Bump
this
and
was.
Grind was omnipresent when I was 13.
You know
years
what?
old.
I was thinking about this too, because I realized that was probably the case.
It's a bit more explicit, though, you know, and suggestive than some other songs that you might hear.
It is not your normal #1 song on
Yeah.
the Billboard Top 200.
Well,
Yeah.
and I was thinking about this because, like, I could definitely see myself in the early mid '90s, late '90s, what have you, like. If I had control over the radio, if something was playing and this came on, I would have turned it off pretty quickly. Like my threshold for like this type of music was pretty low. I don't remember seeing this on MTV, and I'm sure maybe if it was
it
on
was
MTV,
on MTV. It was that video
yeah.
where he's on stage and women are just throwing himself at him.
Yeah, dude, and I probably just, and if that was on, maybe I just turned it off because I really didn't. This was not something that I was seeking out or particularly interested in, to be honest. So giving it a listen this time around, a couple of things on the positive side. Like, I think that I just from the moment that it starts off with Your Body's Calling, I love the way it sounds. So I think the production is really good. That's just that groove. It's very smooth. It's just a nice sound with the beat behind it. And I found that similar throughout the record. I think that it's produced quite well. I can't really place my finger of like, oh, this is definitely from this time. The sound itself seems kind of timeless in a way, for me. I think his voice is outstanding in a lot of places. It is really impressive with what he's doing. And there's some stuff that just seems like he's just totally freestyling, and it's just. And yeah, it's crazy. So I think that his voice was really strong and very good in many of these songs. And I mean, passion, dude. The guy's got emotion coming out all parts, right? He's just all and you
One
know,
part in particular.
yes, yeah, exactly. And I found the rap. There was like several songs. Correct me if I'm wrong. I was counting 4 rap songs like that are particularly rap. So
Sounds
it
about
goes
right. Yep.
like "Homie, Lover, Friend," "Freak That Body," "Summer Bunnies," and "Back to the Hood of Things." Which I don't know who's. I was looking at like it looks like
I think
it
it's
says.
him, isn't it?
No, it can't be him. Is it? It sounds like Dr. Dre. The guy's
That's
got
what
a
I
flow
thought,
like
too.
Dr. Dre, but
He's
it's
credited Dr. Dre, but I don't think
is
he's
he? I'm
rapping.
looking at the credits here, and I'm seeing it just says rap. It says DeAndre Boykins rap, Carrie Kelly, Casey Kelly. I don't know, and I don't know any. And there's no like link to them on Wikipedia. But whoever's rapping, it does. It's got a very Dr. Dre vocal. It's not. It's not Dre though. It's got. But it's almost like they're very similar. So I was picking up on that, and I like those songs. I kind of felt if the R&B in some places would bring me, I was like, okay. The rap brought me back a little bit, and so I like that variety. I think that was good for me because this is a long album. It's an hour. It's over an hour long. So I think
R. Kelly does rap somewhat on this song.
Does he?
Yeah,
What
he
I don't know.
raps on "Homie, Lover, Friend," for example.
Okay. All right. I was picking up mainly on the guy that sounds like Dre, whoever that. I can't imagine that's R. Kelly. But
I
anyway,
thought it was R. Kelly trying to sound like that way when he's
wow.
rapping.
If that's him, I'm impressed
I
because
don't
that's
know.
like a totally
Just
different
kind of
voice.
my interpretation.
So I can't. Yeah. And so generally musically, I enjoyed this. But for a guy for like myself who constantly talks about, I don't care what the lyrics are, like I just want the music to sound. This is kind of like the opposite because the sexual undertones are so overt
Not
in this album.
undertones.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. No, he is out there. He is he's not pulling any punches. He's telling you exactly how he feels. He's being very descriptive. And in and of itself, that would be kind of creepy for me, right? Maybe one song would be like, all right, this is where they let it all out. But he's letting it all out in most of these songs, or many of these songs, particularly the first half. And it just gets so descriptive, and I'm just like, this is kind of gross. It's just like kind of creepy, and like it's just not. And I feel, and it's one of those albums that I'm like, I could not listen to this in public without feeling weird about it, right?
Oh yeah,
and then
sure.
and then you add the layer to it, knowing his history, knowing where he ends up. That you're right, John. I do try to separate the artist from the music. But different than Michael Jackson. Like I can listen to Michael, I can listen to Billie Jean or Beat It or Bad or Smooth Criminal, and he's not singing about little kids. Like you know what I mean? Like he's not. I guess he's doing Heal the World or the Save the Children or whatever. So stuff like that. But that's different than what this is, right? And when you layer that just the nature of the overt sexuality on this and like with who he is, this was overall a ridiculous album for me to get through, and I can't say that I would go back to it. And it's too bad because he's quite talented for sure, and I think a lot of the music on this is pretty good. But man, this is definitely not something that I would go back to, nor could I recommend it to anybody. So I'm gonna have to go with a thumbs down on this. A reluctant thumbs down because the music is good, and if I'm just grading it on that, and oddly enough, one of my favorite songs was Sadie. I was like, that's a nice song, and it's kind of devoted to his mom. I could do without the monologue in the beginning, and then I realized Sadie was a cover. It was like the only song on here that wasn't official. It was the Spinners. It was a song from like the 60s or whatever, or 75, excuse me. So I'm like, well, that tells you something.
It's
so
also out of place for the rest of the album. It's like
it
an
is.
outlier.
It doesn't quite fit exactly, but I was like, I thought that was a very strong song. That was one of my favorite on the record. So yeah, man, yes, John, I like to separate. This was a harder one to do because of the nature of who he is and what happened, and also what he's the very graphic descriptions that he's giving here. So thumbs down for me. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I really kind of went back and forth on this album as well. There's definitely parts I like about it. I agree with you, Matt. His voice is really good. He has a really strong command of
Yeah.
kind of his range and his singing. I think that's kind of what set him apart too. I believe I Can Fly is probably the first thing I heard, but then I always associated him with other like rap groups and, guesting on songs and like his remixes and things like that. I think he like, this album kind of like borders on parody at times. It goes so over the top that like,
I mean, I like the crotch on you as the name of a song.
Right. Right. Which also contains my favorite line, "What's going on inside my pants? I can't explain."
Yeah.
So those things like made me really enjoy it. And Bump and Grind is a really good song. Like I can see why that got number one. And so when those things have like the highs on this are pretty good. Like it kind of transcends my feeling in the back of my head or like kind of the over the top nature of parts of this album. And so, I have to give it credit for that. And, it's got some good beats. Unlike you, Matt, I really did not like the songs that were rapping. I thought they really annoyed me and took away from what I liked about the album. So like I could have, and like you, I was like, is that Dr. Dre? Is it R. Kelly sounding like Dr. Dre? Like what's going on? And I thought the rapping was just kind of weaker compared to the rest of the album. He's best when he's like doing, for better for worse, he's best when he's singing about sex. And like this album is made for fucking, let's just say it. Like that's the vibe that he's going for. And I think it could work depending on the context. And songs like Summer Bunnies are definitely like made for the radio, I think, and kind of more radio friendly. And I think there's songs later by other artists that kind of pull in that like summer vibe and love or girls and kind of that summer attraction type of thing. The way the album ends with Sex Me Parts 1 and 2, I never knew that like he's basically the guy that created his own remixes. Like I didn't realize that like was a thing until I heard this. And like later, I mean, I knew about songs being remixed, but I didn't know like him intentionally like remixing himself was his MO. And between that and like 12 Play, which is also I guess like kind of untitled on the original album, that's just like over the top. I mean, it made me laugh, but it also like made me eye roll. And so it was tough. So like I kind of give this it's a good album, but it is too long in my opinion. And I think like you kind of get by the time you get to the end, like you kind of get the idea. And I think that's like maybe too much of a good thing for me, but I can also like see the appeal and like I enjoyed parts of it. So it was a real kind of like hodgepodge of feelings for me. But so I guess I give like this a moderate thumbs up really.
So I knew this was going to be different for me than you guys because this was an album I knew extremely well. There was in 1993 when this came out, this was amongst the most played albums amongst friends of mine. It was everywhere, and it was kind of funny because you would think it would be just for like young people and stuff, but he had a huge following even with like older folks, despite the intense explicit nature of the lyrics, because of sort of the gospel and the song quality. And I mean, make no mistake about it, this is one of the R&B albums of the 90s, and it's like that it's not going to be a popular opinion, it's going to be a held opinion by people, but if you didn't like kind of process this album in the time, I can understand it's almost impossible to hear this album and detach it from what you know later. It really is. And that's where something like whether, like you said, I can do the Michael Jackson stuff because he doesn't throw up my face and stuff like that. But it's kind of like, like it's not the same extent, but there's some pretty scandalous stories about somebody like Led Zeppelin, right? And they're writing like very sexual songs as well too. But like when you don't know the context before you listen to it, it's kind of
that's true.
Easier to have a nuanced take. Whereas if like you're coming to R. Kelly like you did, Matt, for example, and you're like, oh, my relationship with him is like this guy's in jail for 30 years for like having sex. It's like impossible to listen to an album this
Right.
sexually charged and not say, well, how can I
Yeah.
not mix this together? Totally get it. But when you first came to him as the dude who's belting out
Yeah.
classics, right? Like gospel meets immaculate production meets stuff. I mean, you got to remember, like, in many ways, I think like R. Kelly was processed, certainly by me and people that were listening where I was from, like as like the '90s Stevie Wonder is probably the best way I could describe him. Like that's sort of like where, like the sort of how he was being viewed, right? Because it's like this guy's got all this talent, this production, he's got all these skills. Then he started making all these other tracks, right, and showing other elements, and
he's writing all
versatility.
these songs too, pretty much. He's writing
Correct.
and producing them. Yeah,
Yes,
I'm seeing
writing
here.
and
Yeah.
producing. So and this album is excellently produced. It's I'm not going to say it's flawless R&B, and even at this time there was a little bit of parody to R. Kelly, but I think for a lot of people, like Josh said, like what this music was it's like I won a lane of like carnal R&B.
Yep.
And it was sort of like you could pull this out, and this
Yeah.
was the music that when you were going to take it to another level,
Yeah.
like you could do you could make love, but this was
No, yeah,
fucking
this-
music. And like that's what it was. And men liked it because it was fucking music, and women liked it because he was considered a handsome guy and it was fucking music. You know what I mean? And it's good music. And as a result, like I mean, this to me is an easy thumbs up. That's a hard thing to say because you have to think about, you know, the fact that, you know, who knows, you know, what was inspiring
Right.
these songs with it. And, you know, that comes with the context and stuff. But if we're talking about this just as a music album, I do think you guys underrate this album quite a bit because this album is right up there with the best of 90s R&B and pop for that matter.
Yeah.
And in some ways he has a relationship with sex like Prince does, where he writes about it in a way that's more explicit and almost at the times like you can't tell if he's being serious or not. I think that because of later what happens, you start to take this literal as opposed
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
figurative, like which I think in 1993 when you heard this, right?
Right.
Like there's even a track where he's talking about like girls didn't want to sleep with me at some point, and now I'm famous because they
Now I
do,
have a
and there's, like,
Mercedes, and yeah, look at him now.
right, and there's an element of it like there's a little bit of self-awareness there, a little bit about like I'm playing the sex god, but also I kind of remember what I am and stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's a conscious choice to call the song "I Like the Crotch in You." That's on you. That's, you know, provocative, right?
Right.
And but you see sort of the things that, you know, would lead him to later be a producer who worked with all kinds of legacy artists, all kinds of young artists in different genres. I mean, for Christ's sakes, he charted in the top 10 in a duet with Celine Dion later in the decade. You know what I mean? He's doing stuff with her. He's writing songs for MJ. He's producing Britney Spears songs. You know, he's, you know, kicking around with Usher. You know, he's Ignition remixing. There's all this different stuff. And yeah, it's just such an interesting career because I think like half of the world processes R. Kelly like outside of anything he does musically and just as like the persona and stuff, and then half the people have this very complex version of him because their music, he was a capital S star in their life. And I think you guys might be in the first category, and for me he's in the second category, right? So I just always see the nuance. So yeah, you can ask me, is 12 play a recommend? If you can divorce the context, which I understand is hard. Yeah, of course it is. It's like like an unambiguously great R&B album. And if there wasn't the controversy, I am pretty much certain that you guys would also be able to
it'd
see
probably
it
be.
as an unambiguously great R&B album. With that being said, I completely understand why you can't see it as an unambiguously great R&B album. So there is my take on this album. Whether you want to take my recommendation or not, it is totally fair to not take it or take it. But if you're asking me just from a purely music standpoint, I mean, this has all the things I'm looking for in an R&B album. And if I'm being honest, it's a top 5 R&B album of the 90s and comfortably. So
Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
you guys aren't touching that one.
Can we
So, all right, I'll edit that. Yep. So
I would just say I don't. Yes, my knowledge of him definitely knocks this down, And I would still say I don't think that I don't see the nuance, because I like I said, I think musically.
Oh no, I think you do, Matt. I think
there's a lot.
It's just
Yeah, but I'm saying, like, for me, like, I don't know. I like a little bit, like, it's just the overt versus like subtle sexual innuendo, right? And I think that, like, a little overt is okay. I think this is just, even if it wasn't R. Kelly, if it was somebody else, right?
Yeah.
If it was Stevie Wonder, if he was doing like this music, right? Like, I would still be like, whoa. Like, I don't know. Maybe I'm more of a prude or whatever, but it's enough for me to feel a little uncomfortable. And that's just kind of, and if I'm feeling uncomfortable listening to music, it's not something that I would probably go back to, and want to listen to more of.
While my life itself and my habits do not scream out like the idea of like, I'm completely comfortable with overt sexuality, like, because I'm not a person that, you know what I mean, that's like just a carnal, sensual.
Do you have trouble explaining what's happening in your pants often, John? Is that like?
But what I'm saying is, I am not one of those people that, like, I think that like this is a lane that people do experience as one of their primary senses, and even though I don't get there, I kind of. There's an element of me, just like when we did that Serge Gainsbourg album or Dirty Mind by
that was
Prince,
creepy too. Yeah.
I'm kind of fascinated by people that live in this weird hypersexual world. It's not it's kind of like how so many people are fascinated with serial killers, which I'm not at all, but like it's kind of like they're not going to be a serial killer, but it's sort of like I'm fascinated by people who experience sex this
Do you envy them, John? Is that what it is?
I don't know if envy's the right word. I'm just, it's very interesting because it's not, I'm not like asexual at all, but like, it's, you know what I mean? I don't like, fiend for it in the way that I think. And obviously there's psychological things, all of us having some background in that we can point to and go, well, that certainly would have hypercharged that. But I think, Matt, sometimes you hear it and you're like, this is different. I just can't. Whereas I look at it and I go, this is different. And I am very interested in like, how, this exists, and maybe it doesn't scare me off as much. And maybe Josh splits the difference of the two of us. I'd say.
Maybe so.
So
I'll have to write a term paper on that. Okay.
Yeah, man.
Everybody's got their assignment now.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Feel free to drop your comments.
Yeah.
I'm sure they'll be completely black and completely shades of gray comments. There'll be no black and white takes on that. So
there's no nuance on the internet.
No, it's the internet is well known for its nuanced conversations. So
all right.